Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1910. The rolling hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, stood shrouded in morning mist as they had for countless centuries before. This was an era of rapid transformation for the region. Coal mining operations had expanded dramatically since the completion of the Norfolk and Western Railway in 1883, bringing waves of workers, immigrants from Europe, migrants from the American South, and longtime mountain residents, to extract the rich black gold beneath the ancient Appalachian slopes. Near the small settlement of Organ Cave in a remote hollow tucked away from the main roads, local resident Theodore Blackwood made a discovery that would unsettle even the most hardened minds of the county. Blackwood, a 52-year-old former railroad worker turned small-scale farmer, had been tracking what he believed was a mountain lion that had taken one of his goats the previous night. The trail led him deep into a thickly wooded area where few ventured, some 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. What Blackwood discovered that autumn morning was not the predator he sought, but something far more sinister, a crude wooden door built into the hillside, partially obscured by a strategic arrangement of boulders and vegetation. The craftsmanship suggested it had been there for years, perhaps decades, yet no local resident had ever mentioned such a structure. The door itself bore no markings, only a simple iron handle worn smooth by use. Later, in his account documented in the Greenbrier County Historical Society archives, Blackwood described hesitating before that door for nearly 10 minutes. "Something about the place felt wrong," he wrote. "The birds went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I reckoned whatever lay beyond that door wasn't meant to be found." Blackwood's curiosity eventually overcame his trepidation. Using the butt of his hunting rifle, he broke the rusted padlock that secured the entrance. The hinges protested with an agonizing screech that echoed through the hollow. The stench that emerged from the darkness beyond nearly drove him back, a miasma of decay, dampness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The entrance opened to a narrow passage carved into the hillside, shored up with rough-hewn timber supports that appeared to have been salvaged from a mining operation. Blackwood later recalled counting 27 steps descending into the earth, each one taking him further from the familiar world above. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage widened into what could only be described as a shelter, a series of interconnected chambers excavated from the limestone that dominated this region. The first room measured approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for a man of average height to stand upright. Blackwood, standing at 6'3", was forced to stoop. The walls were lined with shelves containing preserved foods in glass jars, their contents long since turned to unidentifiable mush. Rusted tools hung from pegs, shovels, pickaxes, hammers, alongside what appeared to be mining equipment. A wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in yellowed papers, covered with incomprehensible notations and diagrams. But it was the second chamber that contained the true horror. Blackwood described entering a larger room, perhaps 25 feet across and roughly circular. The walls here had been more carefully finished, almost smoothed, and were covered with crude drawings rendered in what looked like coal and red ochre. The images depicted human figures engaged in what Blackwood could only describe as unwholesome activities, ritual gatherings around strange symbols, figures prostrating themselves before misshapen entities, scenes of transformation that defied rational explanation. The center of the room contained a stone platform approximately 3 feet high and 6 feet in diameter. Channels had been carved into its surface, all leading to a central depression. The stains that discolored the stone told a story that Blackwood, even in his written account, seemed reluctant to fully articulate. "What I saw there," he wrote, "was evidence of practices no God-fearing man should ever witness. There were traces of ceremonies that would sicken even the most hardened soul. The stains spoke of offerings made. The implements arranged around the edge of the platform suggested purposes I dare not commit to paper. The third chamber proved to be living quarters. 6 crude beds lined the walls, each with a small trunk at its foot. The contents of these containers provided the first clues about who might have created this underground sanctuary. Faded photographs, personal effects, and journals written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be German, or perhaps another European language. One journal, partially legible despite water damage, contained entries dating back to 1887. The writer, who signed only as J.M., described fleeing from persecution in Pennsylvania after certain practices were discovered. The writer and 5 companions had apparently found refuge in these isolated hills, where they could continue their work undisturbed. The nature of that work became clearer in later entries. References to the union of above and below, vessels for the crossing, and preparing the way for those who wait beyond suggested a belief system revolving around communication or summoning entities the writer believed existed in some adjacent realm. The final dated entry, from April 1908, spoke of a breakthrough and plans for a grand culmination that would take place when the stars align in the coming year. What happened to the shelter's inhabitants? This question has perplexed researchers ever since. No human remains were found inside, nor was there evidence of a struggle or hasty departure. The food stores and personal belongings suggested the occupants had intended to return, yet according to all available records, no one had been seen entering or leaving the shelter since at least early 1909. Blackwood's discovery quickly drew attention from local authorities. Sheriff William Matterson arrived with 3 deputies the following day, expecting to find evidence of moonshining or perhaps a hideout for outlaws. What they discovered prompted Matterson to contact state officials, who in turn brought in experts from Washington, D.C. Dr. Alexander Winthrop, an anthropologist from Georgetown University who was called to examine the site, wrote in his preliminary report, "The shelter appears to be the headquarters of a cult or secret society whose beliefs incorporate elements of both European occult traditions and possibly local folklore. The iconography suggests a syncretic system combining aspects of alchemy, hermeticism, and what might be corrupted interpretations of Native American spiritual practices." Winthrop's full report, which ran to over 70 pages, has never been made public. Only fragments survive in private correspondence and references in later academic works. One particularly disturbing excerpt, found in a letter Winthrop wrote to a colleague at Harvard, described a hidden recess in the central chamber that contained artifacts of unknown origin and composition, bearing markings that defy cataloging within any known linguistic or symbolic tradition. The investigation took an unusual turn when federal officials abruptly sealed the site in December 1910, just 2 months after its discovery. All materials recovered from the shelter were transported to Washington. Local newspaper accounts of the discovery mysteriously ceased, and those who had visited the site, including Blackwood himself, were instructed not to discuss what they had seen. This official silence gave rise to speculation that continues to this day. Some believed the shelter was connected to a series of disappearances that had occurred in neighboring counties between 1903 and 1908. 5 men and 2 women who had vanished without trace while traveling through the region. Others suggested the site was linked to strange lights that had been reported in the hills around Organ Cave for nearly a decade prior to the discovery. James Porter, who served as Greenbrier County Clerk from 1902 to 1918, kept a private journal that included several entries regarding the shelter. In an entry dated December 14, 1910, he wrote, "Martin from the telegraph office tells me Washington has imposed a complete press blackout regarding the Blackwood discovery. Federal men visited the newspaper office yesterday and confiscated all photographs and notes. Editor Holmes is furious but powerless. Something about that place has frightened the authorities badly. The historical record provides frustratingly few definitive answers. Most official documents relating to the shelter remain classified or have been lost. What we know comes primarily from private correspondence, journal entries, and oral histories collected decades after the events. Emerson Hatfield, whose grandfather served as one of Sheriff Matterson's deputies, shared a family account in a 1963 interview with the West Virginia Folklore Society. "My granddaddy wouldn't talk much about what they found in that hillside, said it was better not to speak of such things. But late at night, after a few drinks, he'd sometimes let slip details that gave me nightmares as a boy. He talked about symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. Said they found a journal describing rituals where participants claimed to see through the eyes of others miles away. The worst part was when he described a room they didn't include in the official report, a small chamber beyond the others where the walls were covered in writing in a language none of them had ever seen before or since." The interview with Hatfield also revealed another disturbing detail. According to his grandfather, one of the deputies who entered the shelter with Sheriff Matterson never fully recovered from the experience. Deputy Frank Holloway began experiencing vivid nightmares immediately following the investigation. Within weeks, he had developed a paranoid belief that he was being followed by entities he could only describe as those who came through. Holloway's condition deteriorated rapidly, and by February 1911, he had been committed to Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, where he remained until his death 17 years later. Professor Margaret Simmons, who conducted historical research on the case in the 1970s, uncovered correspondence between Dr. Winthrop and a colleague at Miskatonic University that shed additional light on the shelter's possible purpose. In a letter dated January 1911, Winthrop wrote, "The spatial anomalies we observed defy conventional explanation. Measurements taken inside and outside the structure do not align. The interior dimensions exceed what is physically possible, given the external parameters. Most disturbing are the acoustic properties of the central chamber, where voices seem to echo from directions that have no source. My preliminary conclusion, though it strains credulity, is that the builders somehow manipulated the physical properties of the space itself." In another letter, dated March 1911, Winthrop described experiments conducted at the site before it was sealed. "We introduced a simple pendulum into the central chamber and observed its oscillation. The results were impossible. The pendulum's movement gradually shifted until it was swinging in patterns that violated basic physical laws. When retrieved, the metal bob had increased in temperature by 17 degrees, despite no apparent energy source. Most troubling was the discovery that its mass had decreased by approximately 0.4 grams. Where this mass went, I cannot say." Winthrop's correspondence grew increasingly erratic over the following months. His final letter to his Miskatonic colleague, written in December 1911, contained ramblings about thinning boundaries and glimpses beyond the veil. He was removed from his position at Georgetown in early 1912 after delivering a lecture in which he claimed academic knowledge was hopelessly inadequate for understanding the true nature of reality as revealed in the West Virginia structure. The most intriguing document to emerge in recent years is a partial transcript of an interview conducted in 1932 with a man identified only as Subject 27, who claimed to have been a member of the group that constructed the shelter. The interview was conducted at Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, where the man had been committed after being found wandering in a disoriented state near the West Virginia border. According to the transcript, Subject 27 described the shelter as a doorway or threshold rather than a hiding place. The group, which he called the Seekers of the Resonant Path, believed that certain geological formations in the Appalachian Mountains created what he termed thin places, where the boundary between our world and another became permeable. "We didn't build the chambers," he reportedly stated. "We found them. The passages were already there, hidden. We merely opened what had been sealed away. The locals, the early settlers, the natives before them, they knew. That's why they avoided that hollow. They could feel it, even if they didn't understand it. The wrongness, the thinness, we were drawn to it. We thought we were so clever, so insightful. We didn't realize we were being lured. When asked what happened to his companions, Subject 27's response was cryptic. They crossed over, or were taken across. The boundary became too thin during our final ritual. I was outside, gathering additional materials. When I returned, the door was open, but the others were gone. Not just gone from the shelter, gone from this side entirely. Sometimes I still hear them. Their voices come to me in dreams, describing what they see. They beg me to join them. They beg me to help them return. The interviewer, Dr. Samuel Morgan, noted that Subject 27 exhibited unusual physical symptoms, including pupils that would periodically dilate to different sizes, fluctuating body temperature, and, most strangely, the apparent ability to identify objects placed behind him without visual cues. At one point during the interview, Morgan reports placing a pen on the table while Subject 27 was facing away. Without turning, the patient said, "The pen is made of silver. It was a gift." The inscription reads, "To Samuel, with gratitude, E.W." Morgan confirmed that the pen had indeed been a gift from a colleague whose initials were E.W., and that the inscription was exactly as Subject 27 had stated, despite having no way to see it. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened to those connected with the investigation. Of the 7 men who comprised the initial federal research team, 4 died under unusual circumstances within 3 years of examining the site. Dr. Os. Winthrop suffered a mental breakdown in 1913 and spent his remaining years in an asylum, reportedly covering the walls of his cell with reproductions of the symbols found in the shelter. Sheriff Matterson resigned his position without explanation in 1911 and relocated to Oregon, breaking all ties with friends and family in West Virginia. Theodore Blackwood, the man who discovered the shelter, continued to live on his small farm until his death in 1927. Neighbors reported that he became increasingly reclusive in his final years, boarding up the windows of his home and refusing to venture outside after sunset. His journal, discovered after his death, contained increasingly paranoid entries describing watchers in the woods and voices calling from the hollow. The journal's final entry, dated 3 days before Blackwood was found dead of an apparent heart attack, read, "They are coming closer now. I hear them in the walls. They whisper that I opened the way, that I am responsible. They say others will follow, that the way remains open despite what the government men believe. They say it was always open and always will be, and that those who know how to look can still find it. God forgive me for what I have done." The physical evidence of the shelter itself has been lost to time. In the spring of 1912, a series of unusually heavy rains triggered a landslide that apparently collapsed the entrance. When government officials returned to conduct further investigations, they found the hillside dramatically altered, with no trace of the doorway Blackwood had discovered. Subsequent attempts to relocate the site using survey data have proven unsuccessful, leading some to suggest the coordinates were deliberately falsified in official records. One persistent rumor claims that the landslide was artificially created to permanently seal the site. Harold Jenkins, whose father worked for the U.S. Geological Survey in the region during that period, shared a story passed down in his family. Dad said they brought in explosives, not just a little, enough to reshape that entire hillside. They set charges deep in the ground, designed to collapse not just the entrance, but the entire tunnel system. What scared me most about Dad's story was that he said they didn't just do it once. They had to go back 3 times because the tunnels kept somehow reopening. The most recent development in this long, mysterious case came in 1968, when construction workers building a new highway through Greenbrier County uncovered what appeared to be part of a man-made tunnel approximately 2 miles from the presumed location of the original shelter. Work was immediately halted, and the area was cordoned off by authorities. No official statement was ever issued regarding what was found, and the planned highway route was mysteriously altered to bypass the area entirely. Local residents reported seeing military vehicles and personnel in the vicinity for several weeks following the discovery. Martin Greaves, who worked on the construction crew, stated in a local newspaper interview that before being ordered to leave the site, he observed men in unmarked uniforms removing metal containers and what looked like stone tablets from the exposed tunnel. Greaves was subsequently visited by government officials who instructed him to retract his statement, which he did. In a private account shared with his family years later, Greaves provided additional details not included in his public retraction. According to his daughter, Caroline Greaves Patterson, her father described seeing a door made of some kind of metal I'd never seen before, not steel or iron, something else. It had symbols all over it, the same kinds of markings that were on those stone tablets they were carrying out. The spookiest thing was that none of the equipment we had could cut through it. Diamond drill bits just broke against it. Finally, they brought in some kind of specialized equipment I'd never seen before. That's when they kicked us all out and made us sign those papers. The Organ Cave region has been the subject of persistent rumors and unexplained phenomena in the decades since. Hikers and hunters occasionally report disorientation and lost time when passing through certain areas near the supposed location of the shelter. Electronic devices malfunction. Compasses spin erratically. Some claim to hear whispers in the dense forest when no one else is present. In 1952, a geological survey team mapping cave systems in the area reported discovering a natural limestone chamber whose walls were covered in symbols similar to those described in accounts of the shelter. Their request for additional research funding was denied, and their preliminary findings were confiscated. The team leader, Dr. James Harriman, subsequently accepted a position with a private research foundation and refused all further comment on the matter. One member of that 1952 survey team, Thomas Collins, broke his silence in a 1978 interview with an independent researcher. Collins, by then suffering from terminal cancer and claiming to have nothing left to lose, described the chamber they discovered. It was perfectly spherical, and I mean perfectly. No natural process forms caves like that. The symbols covered every inch of the surface, and they seemed to be arranged in patterns that repeated across the sphere. Harriman said they represented some kind of mathematical sequence, but not one he recognized. What I remember most was how the place affected our equipment. Batteries drained within minutes, our lights would dim and brighten in rhythmic pulses, and the air felt heavy, like the moment before a lightning strike. We spent maybe 20 minutes in that chamber, but when we came out, our watches showed we'd been inside for over 3 hours. The most compelling recent testimony comes from Eleanor Marsh, whose family has lived in the region for generations. In a 2001 oral history project conducted by Marshall University, Marsh recounted a story passed down from her grandmother, who had been a young woman at the time of the original discovery. Granny said that the men who used that place weren't strangers to the area, Marsh stated. They were regular folks who lived among the community, held jobs, attended church. But they had another life, secret gatherings in remote places. They'd been using caves all through these hills for years, moving from one to another. The place Mr. Blackwood found was just the last one they used before whatever happened, happened. The worst part of Granny's story was that some of those men had wives and families who never knew what they were involved in. After they disappeared, their families just assumed they'd abandoned them, run off somewhere else. Those families continued to live here, had descendants who still live here, which means whatever bloodlines those men represented, whatever knowledge they carried, it might still be here, dormant in the population, waiting. According to Marsh, her grandmother identified several prominent local families whose patriarchs had been among the disappeared. Granny would never say the names out loud, not even in her own home, Marsh recalled. She'd write them on a piece of paper, show me, then burn it immediately. She was terrified of those families, said they weren't right somehow. said sometimes if you looked at them in a certain light at a certain angle, you could see something else looking back from behind their eyes. Historical records confirm that between 1908 and 1911, 6 men from communities around Greenbrier County were reported missing. All were assumed to have left the area in search of work elsewhere, a common occurrence in a region where economic opportunities were limited. No connection to the shelter was ever officially established. The disappearances included Jacob Miller, a blacksmith from Lewisburg; Elias Hatfield, a store clerk from White Sulphur Springs; Samuel Graham, a teacher from Organ Cave; William Tate, a carpenter from Alderson; Michael Schroeder, an immigrant from Germany who worked as a stonemason; and Joseph Allen, a surveyor who had worked extensively throughout the region. All were described in newspaper accounts as respectable citizens with no known reason to abandon their lives. Curiously, county records show that several of these men had been involved in land transactions in the years prior to their disappearances, purchasing small, seemingly worthless plots of land in remote areas. When these transactions were mapped by a researcher in the 1990s, they formed a rough circle with the presumed location of the shelter near its center. In 1997, soil samples taken from the general area where the shelter was believed to have been located showed unusual properties, including abnormal levels of certain rare earth elements and isotopic ratios that deviated from typical values for the region. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the geochemist who analyzed the samples, wrote in her report, "The chemical signature of these soils suggests exposure to conditions not typically found in natural environments. The anomalies are consistent with what might be expected from sustained exposure to certain types of radiation or electromagnetic fields, though the specific source can't be determined from these samples alone." Dr. Chen's request for funding to conduct more extensive testing was denied. Shortly thereafter, she accepted a position with a private aerospace company and ceased her independent research on the samples. In the decades since its discovery, the shelter and its mysterious inhabitants have become part of local folklore, a story told around campfires to frighten teenagers. Yet behind the embellishments lies a documented historical event that remains largely unexplained. What was the true purpose of the underground structure? Who were the people who created or discovered it? What ultimately happened to them? And perhaps most importantly, was their disappearance the end of whatever they had set in motion, or merely the beginning? The answers may lie somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, in classified government archives, or perhaps in the memories and bloodlines of those who still call this region home. Until more evidence emerges, the Macabre shelter discovered in 1910 remains one of Appalachia's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. Some locals still avoid the hollow where Blackwood made his discovery. They say the place feels wrong, that even on the brightest summer day, the air there seems somehow darker, heavier. Wildlife is noticeably absent. Plants grow in strange patterns. According to regional folklore, if you stand in that hollow on certain nights when the moon is just right, you might hear voices carried on the wind, distant conversations in languages no living person speaks. In 1959, folklorist William Ferguson spent 3 nights camping in the area as part of his research into Appalachian legends. In his field notes, later published in the Journal of American Folklore, he wrote, "There is something undeniably oppressive about this location. While I observed no supernatural phenomena, I experienced a persistent sense of being watched, of being in a place where I was not welcome. More troubling was the dream I had each night, identical in content, though I do not typically experience recurring dreams. In it I stood before a door in the hillside. Beyond the door, voices called to me by name, promising to reveal secrets. Each night in the dream I moved one step closer to opening that door. I did not stay for a 4th night." Ferguson's notes also described finding what appeared to be the remains of small stone structures throughout the area, each no larger than a bread box, arranged in geometric patterns that only became apparent when mapped across the broader landscape. These structures, he wrote, appear to be markers of some kind, perhaps delineating a boundary. Most curious is that many show evidence of recent maintenance, cleared of vegetation, stones repositioned if fallen, yet I encountered no one during my time here who might be responsible for this upkeep. Ferguson never returned to the region after his brief investigation. His academic focus shifted away from folklore studies entirely, and he spent his remaining career in linguistics, focusing particularly on what he termed pre-linguistic communication structures. His unpublished papers, donated to the University of Virginia after his death in 1982, included hundreds of pages of diagrams and notations that colleagues described as increasingly abstract and difficult to interpret. The last official investigation into the shelter took place in 1973, when the Department of the Interior conducted a geological survey of the region. Their report noted unusual magnetic anomalies in the vicinity of the presumed shelter location, but offered no explanation for these findings. A recommendation for further study was made but apparently never implemented. Internal memoranda from the Department of the Interior, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2005, revealed disagreements among the survey team about how to interpret their findings. One memo, written by senior geologist Robert Chambers, stated, "The magnetic anomalies in the target area cannot be explained by any known geological process. Their pattern and intensity suggest artificial origin. I strongly recommend involving specialists from other agencies with experience in underground detection systems." A handwritten note at the bottom of the memo reads simply, "Request denied. Matter referred to D7 division under National Security Protocols." No record of a D7 division exists in publicly available government organizational charts. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a professor of anthropology specializing in Appalachian folk practices, has suggested that the shelter may represent a rare example of what she terms syncretistic occultism, the blending of European esoteric traditions with indigenous spiritual practices and local folk beliefs. In her 2005 book, Hidden Current Secret Societies in Appalachia, she writes, "The late 19th century saw an explosion of interest in spiritualism and occult practices across America. While most visible in urban centers, this movement also penetrated rural areas, often taking unique forms as it blended with existing traditions. The isolation of Appalachian communities created perfect conditions for experimental spiritual practices to develop beyond outside scrutiny. The Organ Cave shelter appears to represent a particularly organized and elaborate example of such experimentation. Dr. Vance's research identified several other sites throughout Appalachia with potential connections to occult groups operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These included modified cave systems in Tennessee, a network of stone circles in North Carolina, and a series of unusual structures built into remote mountainsides in Kentucky. None, however, approached the scale or sophistication described in accounts of the West Virginia shelter. "What distinguishes the Organ Cave site," Vance wrote, "is the apparent ambition of its creators. While most rural occult groups focused on divination, healing, or communion with departed spirits, the evidence suggests this group was attempting something far more transformative, possibly the establishment of a permanent connection between worlds or even a physical crossing over." Vance's academic peers have largely dismissed her theories as speculative, noting the limited primary source material available for study. However, her work has gained a devoted following among amateur researchers and has inspired numerous expeditions to the region in search of additional evidence. In 2010, exactly 1 century after Blackwood's discovery, a team of documentary filmmakers attempted to create a comprehensive record of the case for a planned television special. Despite months of preparation and research, the project collapsed when 3 crew members experienced simultaneous medical emergencies while scouting locations near Organ Cave. All 3 suffered identical symptoms: severe nosebleeds, disorientation, and vivid auditory hallucinations described as voices speaking in overlapping layers. Medical examinations revealed no clear cause for their symptoms, which resolved completely within 48 hours of leaving the area. The project's director, Michael Harrington, later told a podcast interviewer, "I've worked in some intense places, war zones, disaster areas, you name it, but I've never felt anything like what we experienced in those woods. It was like the air itself was alive and aware of us, like we were being observed by something we couldn't perceive. The rational part of my brain says it was just some kind of environmental contaminant or shared psychological episode. But another part of me, a more primal part, knows that's not true. Something is still there, still active, still waiting." What makes the case particularly unsettling is how thoroughly it was suppressed. Unlike other historical mysteries that generated ongoing press coverage and public debate, the shelter discovery was effectively erased from public discourse within months. Even local newspapers, typically eager to sensationalize such findings, fell silent on the matter after initial reports. This official silence has led some to suggest government involvement beyond simple concern for public order. Conspiracy theories range from claims that the shelter contained evidence of advanced technology to suggestions that it housed proof of non-human intelligence. More measured speculation has proposed that authorities may have been concerned about the shelter's connections to anarchist or revolutionary groups active during that period. A letter discovered in the personal papers of Congressman James Hughes, who represented West Virginia's 5th District from 1903 to 1913, offers a rare glimpse into official thinking about the case. Writing to a colleague on the House Committee on Military Affairs in February 1911, Hughes stated, "The situation in Greenbrier County has been contained for the present. President Taft has been briefed personally and concurs that complete suppression is the only responsible course. What was discovered is beyond the public's capacity to comprehend without causing widespread alarm. The specialists assure me that the site has been rendered inaccessible permanently. We can only hope their confidence is justified." The letter continues with a passage that has fueled decades of speculation. Most troubling is the possibility that similar locations exist elsewhere. The team reports that the site contained maps indicating at least 7 other locations across the eastern mountains. Search efforts are underway, conducted under the guise of geological surveys. Thus far, 2 additional sites have been located and secured. I need not remind you of the absolute necessity of discretion in this matter. No record exists of these additional sites, nor of the maps reportedly found in the shelter. When questioned about the letter in 1962, the elderly Hughes claimed no recollection of writing it and suggested it might be a forgery. Handwriting experts, however, have confirmed its authenticity. Whatever the truth, the passage of time has made conclusive answers increasingly unlikely. Those with first-hand knowledge of the discovery have long since passed away. Official documents remain inaccessible or lost. The physical evidence has been scattered or destroyed. What remains is the lingering sense of something significant and disturbing, a brief glimpse into unknown territory that was quickly obscured, but not before leaving traces in the historical record and in local memory. Perhaps that is fitting. The shelter, according to the accounts that survive, was itself concerned with boundaries and thresholds, with the places where the known world meets something beyond ordinary understanding. In the rolling hills of West Virginia, beneath the ancient Appalachian soil, secrets remain buried. Sometimes, as Theodore Blackwood discovered on that autumn morning in 1910, the boundary between what we know and what we fear to know is nothing more than a wooden door, waiting to be opened. The passage of time has not diminished local interest in the case. As recently as 2018, a group of amateur researchers attempted to pinpoint the shelter's location using historical records and ground-penetrating radar. Their expedition was cut short when several members experienced severe disorientation, and one suffered an unexplained seizure while searching the area. One member of that expedition, Rebecca Morrison, later published an account of her experience on an online forum dedicated to Appalachian mysteries. "We had been in the woods for about 3 hours when the equipment started malfunctioning," she wrote. "First, the GPS units failed, all of them simultaneously. Then our phones died, even though they'd been fully charged that morning. The compass was the last to go. The needle just started spinning continuously. That's when we noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind in the trees. It was as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off the forest." Morrison described the group becoming increasingly disoriented as they attempted to find their way back to their vehicles. "We should have been able to simply walk downhill to reach the road, but somehow we kept ending up back at the same clearing. The trees looked identical in every direction. The sun seemed to be in the wrong position. When Jason collapsed and started convulsing, we abandoned the equipment and just ran, trying to get away from whatever was happening. I don't remember how we eventually found our way out. One moment we were lost, and the next we were stumbling onto the road nearly a mile from where we had parked." Following this incident, local authorities issued a public statement discouraging amateur investigations in the area, citing hazardous terrain and the presence of abandoned mine shafts. No mention was made of the group's unusual experiences. For those inclined to supernatural explanations, the shelter represents evidence of forces beyond conventional understanding operating in the isolated hollows of Appalachia. For skeptics, it is a case study in how limited information and official secrecy can transform an unusual but explainable discovery into something more mythic. Perhaps the most balanced assessment comes from historian Dr. Rebecca Harkins, who has studied the regional history of Greenbrier County extensively. In a 2010 interview marking the centennial of the shelter's discovery, she observed, "What makes this case so enduringly fascinating is not just what was found, but how quickly and thoroughly it was suppressed. Whether the shelter housed dangerous revolutionaries, religious fanatics, or something else entirely, the authorities clearly believed the public was better off not knowing the full story. That decision has allowed speculation to flourish for over a century. The truth, whatever it may be, now lies buried beneath layers of rumor, folklore, and deliberate obfuscation. In that sense, the shelter remains sealed away, not by earth and stone, but by time and silence." Dr. Harkins also noted an interesting pattern in how the story has been preserved and transmitted. Almost every family in the region has some version of the shelter story passed down through generations. Yet these versions often contradict each other on key details: the exact location, what was found inside, who was involved. The only consistent elements are the discovery itself and the subsequent government intervention. It's as if the story has been deliberately fragmented, with each family holding just one piece of a larger puzzle. This pattern extends beyond oral traditions. Documents related to the case frequently contain inconsistencies or obvious gaps. Photographs rumored to exist of the shelter's interior have never surfaced. The few sketches that remain show significant variations in the layout and contents of the chambers. As with many historical mysteries, the passage of time has not brought clarity, but rather deepened the shadow surrounding the case. Each generation has interpreted the limited evidence through the lens of its own fears and preoccupations. During the Cold War, some saw the shelter as evidence of foreign infiltration. The environmental movement of the 1970s generated theories about secret government testing of chemical agents in remote areas. The New Age spirituality of the 1980s and 1990s recast the shelter's occupants as seekers of higher consciousness rather than practitioners of dark rituals. What remains consistent across these interpretations is the central image: a hidden door in a hillside leading down into darkness, where something awaited that defied easy explanation. In recent years, interest in the case has surged again, fueled by the Internet's ability to connect researchers and enthusiasts across geographical boundaries. Online forums dedicated to the shelter mystery have thousands of members who share documents, analyze historical records, and organize expeditions to the region. One such forum, the Blackwood Door, maintains an extensive digital archive of materials related to the case, including previously unpublished photographs, letters, and oral history recordings. The site's administrator, who goes by the username Resonant Seeker, claims to be a descendant of one of the shelter's original inhabitants. In a rare public statement, Resonant Seeker wrote, "For generations, my family has preserved the truth about what happened in 1910. The story told in historical records barely scratches the surface." What Theodore Blackwood stumbled upon was not just a physical shelter, but a nexus point, a place where the membrane between realities had grown dangerously thin. The group that used the site wasn't trying to escape from society, but to forge a connection with something they believed existed alongside our world, separated by a barrier that could be traversed under the right conditions. The statement continued, "They succeeded beyond their expectations and were unprepared for the consequences. What crossed over when they opened the way wasn't what they anticipated. It used them, changed them, and ultimately took them somewhere else. But the door, once opened, could not be fully closed." The government understood this, which is why their response was so drastic. They weren't just hiding evidence of a cult or covering up disappearances. They were attempting to seal a breach in reality itself. While such dramatic claims are impossible to verify, they reflect the enduring power of the shelter story to inspire speculation and fear. The blend of documented historical events with supernatural elements creates a narrative that resists easy dismissal. In 2019, a team from West Virginia University's Department of Geology conducted a comprehensive geological survey of the Organ Cave region using advanced ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. The official purpose was to map subsurface limestone formations for a study on water resources. But rumors circulated that the true goal was to finally locate the shelter's remains. The team's published findings contained no reference to artificial structures or anomalies. However, Dr. Marcus Jenkins, who led the study, resigned his position shortly after the project's completion and has declined all requests for interviews since. A graduate student who worked on the project later claimed anonymously that certain data had been excluded from the final report at the request of external partners who had provided partial funding for the research. In 2020, a series of unexplained phenomena in the region brought renewed attention to the shelter legend. Residents of several communities in Greenbrier County reported unusual sounds emanating from the surrounding forests, described variously as low humming, rhythmic tapping, or distant voices. Electronic devices experienced unexplained malfunctions. Several people reported vivid dreams featuring symbols reminiscent of those allegedly found in the shelter. Most significantly, 3 separate hikers in different locations reported encountering what they described as a wooden door set into a hillside, only to be unable to relocate it when they returned with others. Each encounter supposedly occurred during unusual atmospheric conditions, one during a rare type of fog, another during a solar eclipse, and the third during an intense geomagnetic storm caused by solar flare activity. Local authorities attributed these reports to suggestion and the power of the shelter story in regional consciousness. Professional skeptics pointed out the tendency for legend tripping to generate seemingly supernatural experiences, particularly in locations with strong folkloric associations, yet the reports continue. Every few months, someone new claims to have glimpsed the door, always momentarily, always vanishing when sought again. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not what was found behind that door, but the implication that such doorways might exist undetected throughout the seemingly familiar landscape, thresholds to something that exists alongside our everyday world, separated by boundaries thinner than we care to contemplate. The hollow where Theodore Blackwood made his discovery over a century ago still exists, though few can agree on its exact location. Trees grow there. Rain falls, seasons change. To a casual observer, it appears no different from countless other secluded valleys tucked into the ancient Appalachian hills. But those who know the story might notice how the birds fall silent as you approach a certain point. They might feel the subtle resistance in the air, as if the place itself were holding its breath. And they might wonder, as they stand on ground that feels somehow wrong beneath their feet, just how secure the boundaries are between the world we know and the spaces that lie beyond our understanding. For in the end, the Macabre shelter discovered in 1910 isn't just a historical curiosity or local legend. It's a reminder of how thin the veneer of comprehension truly is, how close we might be at any moment to opening a door we cannot close again. The most recent chapter in this ongoing mystery began in April 2022, when a severe storm system moved through Greenbrier County, resulting in widespread flooding and several landslides. In the aftermath, county maintenance workers, clearing a blocked rural road near Organ Cave, discovered what appeared to be a man-made tunnel exposed by a collapsed embankment. According to initial reports, the tunnel entrance was approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, lined with fitted stone blocks of unusual composition. Workers described the stone as glossy black, almost like polished obsidian, and noted that it remained cool to the touch despite direct sunlight. Most strangely, they reported that water from the recent rains seemed to avoid the exposed tunnel entirely, flowing around it rather than into it, in apparent defiance of gravity. County officials cordoned off the area pending investigation by structural engineers, citing safety concerns about further collapses. Within hours, however, witnesses reported the arrival of unmarked vehicles and personnel in hazmat suits. Access to the road was restricted for 11 days, with official statements citing environmental contamination concerns from a previously unknown chemical dump site. When the road reopened, the exposed tunnel was nowhere to be seen. The embankment showed signs of extensive reconstruction, with fresh concrete reinforcing the slope. Workers involved in the original discovery were reassigned to projects in other parts of the county. Inquiries to local officials about the tunnel were met with denials that anything unusual had been found. One maintenance worker, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a local blogger, "What they're saying now isn't what happened. We found something old down there, something that shouldn't have been there. The inside of that tunnel wasn't natural. The walls had writing on them, symbols like nothing I've ever seen. And there was this smell coming from inside. Not bad exactly, just wrong somehow. Made my head hurt just being near it." Whatever they did during those 11 days, they went to a lot of trouble to make sure nobody will find that place again. No photographs of the tunnel have surfaced, though rumors persist that one of the workers captured images on his phone before authorities arrived. If such photos exist, they have not been shared publicly. This incident, whether connected to the 1910 shelter or not, demonstrates how the pattern of discovery and suppression continues to repeat itself in the region. Strange findings quickly contained and obscured, official explanations that strain credulity, and lingering questions that find no satisfactory answers. Perhaps most unnerving are the changes reportedly observed in those who were first on the scene at the exposed tunnel. Co-workers describe them as withdrawn, suffering from persistent headaches and sleep disturbances. Several have taken extended leaves of absence. One reportedly relocated abruptly to another state without explanation. These details echo the accounts of those who encountered the original shelter, the psychological effects that followed exposure to whatever waited below the ground. From Theodore Blackwood to Sheriff Matterson's deputies, from the federal researchers to the construction workers in 1968, a consistent pattern emerges. Contact with these underground structures leaves an indelible mark on those who experience it. The story of the Macabre shelter continues to evolve, each new incident adding layers to a mystery that spans generations. Whether understood as a historical anomaly, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in isolated places, or evidence of something beyond conventional understanding, the case remains an unsettling reminder of the unknown spaces that exist alongside the world we think we know. In the rolling hills of West Virginia, beneath the ancient Appalachian Mountains that have stood watch since before human memory, something waits. Perhaps it has always waited there, existing in the hollow spaces beneath the surface, separated from our everyday reality by barriers of earth and stone, and more intangible boundaries. Sometimes, as Theodore Blackwood discovered on that autumn morning in 1910, those boundaries become visible as simple wooden doors built into hillsides, almost asking to be opened. Sometimes they manifest as strange tunnels uncovered by storms, or anomalous chambers discovered during geological surveys, or symbols carved into cave walls that seem to shift when viewed directly. The true nature of what exists beyond these thresholds remains unknown, perhaps unknowable by conventional means. But the persistent reports across decades suggest that whatever it is, it remains active, patient, and perhaps most disturbingly, interested in those who happen upon its points of access. For those who have studied the case most deeply, the most troubling question is not what Theodore Blackwood found when he opened that door in 1910, but what might have found him and, by extension, found its way into our world. The macabre shelter in this light was never truly sealed, despite the government's efforts. The landslide, the explosives, the concrete, these physical barriers address only the most obvious access point. But if the accounts of thin places and permeable boundaries have any truth to them, then other doors exist, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps to open themselves when conditions are right. In the words of Dr. Alexander Winthrop, written shortly before his mental collapse, we delude ourselves with the comforting belief that reality is stable and singular. The truth, as revealed by the West Virginia structure, is far more disturbing. The boundaries we take for granted are neither solid nor permanent. They flex, thin, and sometimes tear entirely. What lies beyond these ruptures is not empty space, but something occupied and aware. Our conventional understanding provides no framework for comprehending such entities, leaving us vulnerable to their influence. We opened a door believing ourselves the discoverers, never considering that perhaps, from the other side, we were the discovered. As you travel the back roads of West Virginia, winding through ancient mountains and isolated hollows where cell signals fade and GPS units falter, remember this: not all doors are meant to be opened. Not all discoveries are benign. Sometimes the boundary between curiosity and danger is as thin as a wooden door set into a hillside, waiting for someone who cannot resist the temptation to see what lies beyond. And if you should happen upon such a door, remember Theodore Blackwood and what his discovery cost him. Remember the 6 men who vanished without trace. Remember the investigators driven to madness or silence. Consider whether some mysteries are better left unexplored, some doors better left unopened. For in the hills of West Virginia, some secrets have waited far longer than human memory, and may continue waiting long after we are gone.